I'm 72 years old and only now can I say that without diverting my thoughts. For a long time, age was just a number that I avoided staring, as if looking at it would admit everything that happened without me noticing. I spent almost my entire life believing in what I was taught about love, about staying, about putting up with it. They said it was normal, that it was just like that, and I accepted. I accepted because it seemed easier than questioning. Today I know that that facility had a high price. For many years, I repeated ideas that weren't really mine. He believed that staying was a sign of maturity, that giving in avoided conflicts, and that silence kept the peace. These beliefs gradually entered my routine, until they became part of my way of life. I didn't choose them consciously, I just incorporated them. When I realized, they were already there, guiding my decisions. And I went on without thinking too much, because thinking too much always seemed dangerous. From an early age, I learned to observe before I spoke. I grew up understanding that there were right times for everything, and that my moment was almost never a priority. I learned to measure words, to understand the atmosphere of the environment, to feel when it was better to be quiet. At first, this seemed like politeness and care. Over time, it became constant caution. Then, it became automatic silence. There was no major event that changed everything at once. What happened was a slow accumulation of small choices made to avoid wear and tear. Small withdrawals that I called responsibility. I always told myself that it was just a phase, that soon things would fall into place. But the years went by, and nothing fitted. Only I adapted more and more. For a long time, I confused presence with love. I thought that being there every day meant being important, that sharing the same house, the same routine, was enough, even when my opinions were no longer considered. Even when my desires were postponed indefinitely. I kept going, because I thought that going on was the right thing to do. To those looking from the outside, my life seemed stable. There were no major conflicts, no visible ruptures. Everything seemed organized, correct, as expected. I myself helped to maintain this image. He replied that everything was fine, smiled when necessary, avoided long explanations. Not always because I wanted to deceive others, but because I myself did not know how to explain what I felt. At night, sometimes, there was a discomfort that was difficult to define. It was not clear sadness, nor anger. It was as if something was out of place. A feeling of living a life that didn't completely fit me. These thoughts appeared quickly, but I pushed them away just as quickly. There were always tasks, responsibilities, someone needing me. Time passed without asking permission. The days began to look too much like each other. Decisions became automatic, almost mechanical. I did what needed to be done, kept everything running, moved on. Without realizing that, little by little, I stopped choosing. I just kept going, because that's what I knew how to do. Today, looking back, I can see signs that once seemed invisible. They had always been there, but I had no words to name what I felt. He also had no internal permission to question. I believed for a long time that it was love. Only now can I admit that it wasn't. It took me 72 years to understand what I lost. It was not just a relationship or a specific time in life. It was a whole part of me that fell by the wayside. Acknowledging this hurts, more than I care to admit. But for the first time, I also feel like I'm telling the truth. And that changes everything. The fact that you're here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about the sensitivity you carry. What comes next is not just about my life, it's about silent truths that many people take decades to see. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue to be told, sign up. This is the simplest way to support and keep these voices alive. I was born in a small town, one of those where everyone knows each other and little is said about feelings. My family was simple, without major faults, but also without excesses. We never went through extreme need, but we learned early to value the little that existed. Since I was a child, I understood that stability was something precious, something that was not questioned. Things were as they were, and that's it. Nobody explained much, just followed. My mother was a tired woman, although she rarely admitted it. She did everything that needed to be done, took care of the house, the children, and whatever else came her way. He didn't complain, he didn't ask for help, he didn't show weakness. I grew up observing this, understanding that being a woman meant taking care of everything in silence. She did not say these things out loud, but taught by example every day. My father was a strict man, accustomed to being obeyed. He was not someone who made big explosions, but his presence required caution. One look was all it took for everyone to know when it was time to stop talking. I quickly learned to notice mood swings, to adjust my behavior according to the environment, not out of open fear, but out of adaptation. It was easier that way. In our house, emotions were not discussed. Problems were solved with work and silence. If something bothered him, he kept it. If it hurt, it was endured. Too many questions were seen as unnecessary. I grew up understanding that expressing feelings only complicated things. So I learned to swallow, to let go, to conform before I even tried. At school, I was a quiet child. It didn't attract attention, it didn't create problems. Adults praised my behavior, said I was mature for my age. That made me proud, because being praised meant doing something right. No one asked what I felt. And I didn't know I could speak either. Over time, I realized that being discreet made life easier. People expected little from me, and that felt safe. I molded myself to fit expectations, not realizing that I was leaving important parts aside. My desires were small, almost invisible. And when they appeared, I tried to reduce them myself. At home, I learned that conflicts wore out, and wear and tear was something to be avoided. So I started to choose silence before I even thought about speaking. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a reflex. When something bothered me, I took a deep breath and moved on. There was always something more important than me. This way of living has become natural. I didn't feel like I was giving up something, because I never learned that I had the right to choose differently. What I was taught seemed to be the only possible way to live in peace. And I wanted peace. I wanted not to cause problems, not to be a burden, not to displease. When I reached adulthood, I already knew exactly how to act. He knew how to listen more than talk, give in more than ask, accept more than question. All of this seemed normal, almost automatic. I didn't see it as a loss. I saw it as a virtue. And that shaped every choice I made afterwards. Today, looking back, I realize that it was there that it all began. Not in a major trauma, nor in a specific event. But in that silent learning that being silent was safer. It was there that I learned to disappear a little, without even realizing it. And I took this lesson with me for the rest of my life. I grew up surrounded by rules that were never said out loud, but that everyone seemed to know. They were not written anywhere, but they were felt in the air of the house. I learned them by observing, making few mistakes, correcting quickly. He knew when to speak and, especially, when not to speak. Over time, these rules came to seem natural. As if they had always been part of me. One of those rules was not to bother. I learned that loved ones were those who made life easier for others. That asking too much was tiring, that questioning too much created tension. So I began to adjust my requests, to reduce my desires even before expressing them. He did this almost without realizing it, as if learning a simple habit. Nobody told me to do it like that. I just did it. Another rule was to be grateful. Grateful for what I had, grateful for what I received, grateful even for what hurt. Complaining was seen as ingratitude, and I didn't want to carry that label. So when something bothered me, I thought about everything that could be worse. There was always someone in a more difficult situation. And that was enough for me to shut up. I also learned that feelings were sensitive subjects. They did not put themselves at the table, they did not discuss each other openly. Strong emotions were seen as exaggeration. So I learned to smooth everything, even what wasn't light. If something hurt, I disguised it. If something saddened, I followed. Life called for firmness, not sensitivity. These rules have shaped the way I see the world. I came to believe that harmony depended on my ability to give in. That keeping everything running required personal sacrifice. And that this sacrifice was expected, almost obligatory. I didn't see it as injustice. I saw it as responsibility. And he carried it seriously. When I started to relate to other people outside the family, I took these rules with me. They guided me in conversations, decisions, and important choices. I adapted easily, I molded my behavior according to the environment. People said I was understanding, easy to deal with. I smiled when I heard this, without noticing the other side. There were times when I felt like saying something different. To take a stand, to disagree, to ask for more. But these desires were always accompanied by an internal alert. A feeling that I might be exaggerating. That maybe it wasn't that important. And then I would step back, as I had always done. Over time, I began to confuse these rules with who I was. I no longer knew where the apprenticeship ended and where my true will began. I acted on automatic, repeating patterns that seemed safe. Questioning meant tinkering with old structures. And I didn't know if I would have the strength to sustain it. These unwritten rules accompanied me into adulthood without me realizing it. They influenced the kind of relationship I accepted, the kind of silence I tolerated, the kind of absence I normalized. Everything seemed consistent with what I had learned. Nothing sounded strange. Nothing seemed wrong enough to be stopped. Today, I can see these rules more clearly. I see how they protected me at times, but also how they deeply limited me. They taught me how to survive, but not how to live fully. And recognizing this is painful. Because it means admitting that I followed paths that I never questioned. It was by obeying these invisible rules that I got here. They prepared the ground for everything that would come after. For the choices I made, for the ones I failed to make. And, mainly, for the silences I kept for so many years, believing they were necessary. I met who would become my companion at a time when I was already used to adapting. I wasn't looking for great emotions, just stability. He seemed to offer just that. He was someone decisive, self-assured, with firm opinions. In the beginning, this security gave me tranquility. I felt that, next to him, I wouldn't have to think so much. It was enough to follow. At first, his attention made me feel chosen. He gave his opinion about my clothes, my schedules, my friendships. He said it was care, concern, zeal. I believed it. After all, I had never learned to differentiate attention from control. If someone cared enough to notice me, I understood it as affection. It didn't occur to me to question it. Gradually, some things began to change. My wishes began to be evaluated before being accepted. My plans needed to be explained. Some opinions were easily discarded, as if they were unimportant. I felt a slight but constant discomfort. Still, he didn't see it as a real problem. It just felt like part of sharing life with someone. When I tried to position myself, the reaction was never aggressive. It was more subtle. A prolonged silence, a comment that made me doubt myself, a phrase that sounded like advice, but carried reproach. I was beginning to wonder if I wasn't exaggerating, if I wasn't being too sensitive. And, almost always, he ended up retreating. Over time, I adjusted my behavior to avoid these moments. He thought before he spoke, filtered desires, anticipated reactions. Not because someone forced me directly, but because I wanted to maintain harmony. He believed that relationships required this kind of effort, and I was willing to do my part. There were situations in which I felt like leaving. Small internal alerts appeared, especially when I realized that I was giving up things important to me. But soon other voices came, internal and external, saying that it was just like that. That lasting relationships required compromise. That no one was perfect. I compared my situation to other people's and always found reasons to keep going. There were no shouts, no great conflicts. Everything was done in a discreet, almost polite way. It made me think I had nothing to complain about, that I was privileged to have someone by my side. And that idea kept me there. I started to confuse stability with happiness. If there were no ruptures, I understood it as success. If everything was still working, I thought it was right. Even when I felt diminished, I told myself that it was just a phase. That love matured and became quieter over time. Without realizing it, I moved away from who I was. I stopped asking questions, expressing opinions, insisting on wills. Everything seemed simpler that way. I adapted, he decided, and life went on. At least that's what I believed at that moment. Today I can see more clearly what happened. That initial attention was not love as I imagined. It was a form of control disguised as care. But, at that time, I had no references to realize this. I just followed what I had learned from an early age. That's how I stayed. Not for lack of signs, but for excessive justifications. I believed that I was being mature, understanding, loving, when, in fact, it was just repeating old patterns. And confusing attention with love was the first big mistake I made without realizing it. There was a moment when I realized, with some clarity, that something was not right. It was not a great discussion or an evident rupture. It was more of a lingering feeling of discomfort, as if I was always adjusting too much. I felt like I was giving up important things, but I couldn't say exactly what. Still, the idea of leaving seemed distant, almost impossible. Staying was simpler. Going would require questions that I never learned to answer. Where I would go, how I would start, what people would say. All of this scared me more than the silent dissatisfaction I already knew. The known, even when it hurts, gives a false sense of security. And I clung to it tightly. I told myself that it wasn't that serious. That every relationship has its difficulties. That no one lives happily all the time. He repeated these phrases as if he were convinced of something he did not feel. It was a way to justify staying, to make the constant discomfort I carried acceptable. There was also guilt. Guilt for thinking about leaving, for imagining a different life, for wanting something beyond what I had. I wondered if I wasn't being ungrateful. After all, I didn't lack anything material. This constant comparison made me doubt my own feelings and kept me still. There were days when I almost took courage. I thought about talking, about exposing what I felt, about trying to change something. But when he imagined the reaction, he retreated. I already knew the way: long explanations, uncomfortable silences, the feeling of being wrong for feeling too much. And I didn't want to go through that again. Over time, I became convinced that staying was a responsible choice. I had commitments, a built life, expectations around me. Leaving seemed selfish, it felt like giving up. And I always learned that giving up was not an acceptable option. So I stayed, even when it cost me. I told myself that I was strong. That enduring was part of adult life. That there was a value in it. This thought gave me some solace, as if suffering had a purpose. If I was there, it was because I needed to be. Questioning this seemed too dangerous. Meanwhile, my desires were getting smaller and smaller. Not because they disappeared, but because I learned to hide them better. I already knew what could or could not be said, what was acceptable or not desired. And this constant adaptation tired me more than I admitted. Staying also spared me the judgment of others. The people around saw continuity, stability, normality. I didn't need to explain anything, nor justify difficult decisions. It was enough to continue. And at that point in my life, continuing seemed easier than facing the unknown. Today, looking back, I see that this was one of the quietest choices I made. There wasn't a day when I consciously decided to stay forever. I just kept going, one day after another. And when I realized, the years had passed. Staying seemed easier than going. But the easy then turned into the weight I carry now. Not because I couldn't have left, but because I never allowed myself to consider that possibility for real. And this perception, today, hurts more than any farewell would have hurt back then. Over time, silence is no longer just a choice and has become part of the routine. It was no longer something I consciously decided, it just happened. I woke up, did my chores, talked about what was necessary and kept the rest to myself. Talking less seemed to avoid problems. And avoiding problems has become a goal in itself. I already knew which subjects brought discomfort. He knew what could generate an impatient look, a dry comment or a silent withdrawal. So I started avoiding these topics before I even thought about them completely. It was a form of self-protection, although I didn't call it that at the time. I just said that I was being practical. The conversations became superficial. We talked about what needed to be done, about commitments, about routines. Almost never about feelings, desires, or dissatisfactions. When something bothered me, I solved it alone, inside me. I thought that dividing would be creating an unnecessary problem. And I didn't want to be seen as someone difficult. There were times when I felt like saying more. To explain how certain attitudes affected me, to ask for change, to be heard. But these desires were accompanied by an anticipated fatigue. I already knew the likely outcome. So I gave up before I even tried. Over time, I started to listen to myself less. My own reactions began to be ignored by myself. If something bothered me, I wondered if it was really worth it. I almost always concluded that it was not. This way of thinking kept me away from what I really felt, without me realizing it. The silence also made me seem stronger. People thought I handled everything well, that nothing affected me. I rarely complained, rarely showed fragility. This generated compliments, comments about my patience and balance. And I accepted, even though I knew there was a cost behind it. Inside the house, silence has become a language of its own. I learned to interpret gestures, pauses, tones of voice. Many things did not need to be said, because I already knew how to act. This constant adaptation kept me attentive all the time. It was a permanent state of emotional vigilance. There were days when I felt exhausted without knowing exactly why. It was not a physical fatigue, but something deeper. I would go to bed at night with the feeling of having spent the whole day containing myself. But the next day, everything started again in the same way. And I followed. The hardest thing was to realize that the silence didn't just bother me. He also created a distance that was difficult to cross. But even so, I preferred this distance to the risk of conflict. The idea of bringing about a change seemed heavier than continuing as it was. Gradually, I stopped expecting to be understood. I came to believe that some things simply wouldn't be understood. This acceptance made me sad, but it also anesthetized me. It was easier not to wait than to be frustrated. And I got used to it. Today, looking back, I see that the silence has been accumulating like layers. Every time I stopped talking, I reinforced the habit, until it stopped being a strategy and became part of who I was. Silence has become routine. And it took me a long time to realize how much it took me away from myself. Over the years, my life has been organized around the needs of others. There was always something to be done, someone to be met, some expectation to fulfill. I was easily busy, because being busy kept me from thinking too much. Caring for others seemed to give meaning to my days. And I clung to it tightly. The marriage ran its course without major disruptions. Everything worked, at least in appearance. There was routine, commitments, responsibilities divided unequally, but accepted. I did what needed to be done, without questioning too much. He thought that this was the basis of a stable life, and stability has always seemed valuable to me. When the children came, my attention turned entirely to them. Being a mother has become my main role, almost exclusively. I dedicated myself completely, trying to do everything in the best possible way. My desires were even more in the background. After all, there were now clear priorities, and I knew exactly where I fit in. Taking care of the children gave me a sense of usefulness and belonging. I felt that, at least there, my presence was necessary. This softened the emptiness that I could not explain. I gave myself to the routine seriously, believing that I was doing the right thing. And, in a way, it was, but at a very high cost. Meanwhile, I was moving away from myself without realizing it. There was no room to ask what I wanted or needed. My days were filled with tasks, schedules, and obligations. When some personal desire arose, it seemed out of place. So I would put it aside, as I did with so many other things. People around saw a dedicated, responsible, present woman. I received praise for my strength, for my ability to handle everything. These compliments kept me grounded, but they also held me back. I felt that I needed to continue being that person, even when I was too tired to sustain this role. There were times when I wondered what my life would have been like if I had made different choices. These questions came quickly, almost like a whisper, and I would soon push them away. Thinking about it seemed pointless and even dangerous. After all, my life was already built. What would be the point of questioning now? Over time, I began to believe that my job was to keep everything running, that my value was in sustaining the family structure. I didn't see it as a prison, but as a duty. And duty, for me, has always been something that is fulfilled, not something that is discussed. So I kept going, even when I felt empty. When the children grew up and began to follow their own paths, I felt a mixture of pride and strangeness. My routine began to change, and spaces that had previously been occupied were empty. I was no longer as needed as before. And this brought a different, deeper and more uncomfortable silence. It was at that moment that I began to realize how much my life had been built for others. I had fulfilled all the expected papers, done everything correctly. But when I looked at myself, I found it difficult to recognize who I was beyond that. And this realization accompanied me like a silent weight, preparing the ground for everything that would come later. When the house began to become quieter, something strange began to accompany me. It was not open sadness, nor clear suffering. It was a diffuse guilt, difficult to explain, as if I was failing at something without knowing exactly what. I woke up with this feeling and carried it with me throughout the day. He tried to ignore it, but she insisted on staying. I felt guilty about small things. For resting too much, for wanting to be alone, for not feeling the same disposition as before. Sometimes I felt guilty simply because I wasn't doing anything, as if rest were a mistake. I had spent so much time being useful that I no longer knew how to exist without a defined function. This guilt was not accompanied by a clear accusation. Nobody told me I was wrong. It was something that came from within, built over the years. A silent voice that reminded me that I should be doing more, being more, holding on more. And I obeyed, even when tired. There were times when I thought I had already done my part. I raised my children, kept my house, fulfilled my obligations. Still, this idea was accompanied by discomfort, as if admitting this was a sign of selfishness. I didn't know how to rest without justifying myself. I compared my life to that of other people my age. I always found someone who seemed more active, more willing, more present. This reinforced the feeling of inadequacy. I wondered if I was complaining for no reason. If not, I should simply thank you and move on, as I always did. Even when something bothered me deeply, I relativized. He said that it wasn't that important, that it had already passed, that it wasn't worth touching the past. This posture kept me moving, but it also prevented me from looking inward. It was easier to carry the guilt than to face the questions. This nameless guilt manifested itself in the body. A constant tiredness, a lack of enthusiasm that is difficult to explain. It wasn't something I could point out in exams or consultations. It was just a silent weight that accompanied me. And I accepted it, as I accepted so many other things. Sometimes I wondered when I had started to feel this way. I tried to remember a specific moment, but I couldn't find it. The guilt seemed to have grown with me, mixing with responsibilities and renunciations. It didn't come suddenly. It has always been there, getting stronger. I didn't talk about it with anyone. I didn't know how to explain something so abstract. To say that I felt guilty without knowing the reason seemed exaggerated, so I kept it to myself. And, as always, silence seemed the safest option. It was only a long time later that I began to suspect that it wasn't my fault. That maybe it was the result of years of annulling me, of years living to correspond. But, at that moment in history, I still didn't have that clarity. I just felt the weight and kept carrying it. This nameless guilt became part of my emotional routine. I lived with her as someone who lives with an old pain, one of those that we learn to endure. Not knowing that, sooner or later, it would demand to be looked at head-on. The years passed in a silent, almost polite way. They didn't arrive causing major changes, they just accumulated. One year pulling the other, without pauses for reflection. I followed the routine as I always did, believing that there was still time to think about myself later. I just didn't realize when that after ceased to exist. The days began to look too much. Waking up, taking care of the house, solving what came up, sleeping. Everything worked, but without brilliance. I didn't exactly feel unhappy, just distant. As if I was physically present, but absent from myself. This feeling was constant, but I was already used to it. I never stopped to ask myself what I really wanted. That question just wasn't part of my vocabulary. I knew what needed to be done, what was expected, what was right. But desiring something of one's own seemed like a strange luxury. Something that didn't suit me or the life I had built. When someone asked if I was okay, I automatically answered yes. Not because I was consciously lying, but because I didn't know how to answer differently. Being well meant not causing concern. And I always learned that this was the main goal. There were times when I felt like changing something. He thought of small changes, nothing radical. But I was soon convinced that it wasn't worth it. He had gone too far to move now. This justification was repeated frequently, keeping me in exactly the same place. Time has also brought changes in the body. Fatigue became more present, the pace slowed down. It made me realize that I wasn't the same as before. Even so, I continued to demand from myself as if nothing had changed. I charged myself for not keeping up with the pace that was no longer possible. The children grew up, their lives went on. I watched from afar, proud, but also out of place. It was no longer the center of anything. And it made me realize how much my identity was linked to the role I played for so many years. Without him, I felt like I had no defined place. Sometimes, I wondered where the woman I once was had gone. I tried to remember what I liked, what I dreamed of, what excited me. The answers were vague, imprecise. It was like looking for something in a house that no longer exists. The memory was there, but access seemed blocked. The years passed without ever asking me if I was happy. And I never asked either. I accepted silence as company, routine as destiny. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was known. And the known has always seemed safer than the new. Today I understand that it was not a lack of opportunities. It was a lack of internal space to question. I lived for many years without consulting myself, without listening to myself, without allowing myself to desire. And this absence of questions has shaped my entire trajectory. The years passed without asking. And I let it go. Not by carelessness, but by learning. I learned to follow without looking inside. I just didn't know that, one day, this lack of questions would take a heavy toll. And that moment was closer than I imagined. The fatigue began to manifest itself in a different way. It wasn't that tiredness that gets better with a night's sleep or a more peaceful day. It was something deeper, more persistent. I woke up already tired, as if I hadn't really rested. And this accompanied me throughout the day, with no clear explanation. I tried to justify this fatigue with age. I told myself that it was normal, that it was part of the time passing. But there was something that didn't fit. It wasn't just physical. It was a constant burden, a feeling of always being behind in relation to life itself. Like I'm carrying something invisible. Even on days when I didn't do much, the fatigue was there. I sat down, tried to relax, but the mind didn't follow the body. Thoughts came without being called. Memories, doubts, old questions that were never asked. Everything arose when silence set in. I started to avoid these moments of pause. He kept the television on, invented small tasks, occupied his time with anything. Keeping quiet with myself seemed dangerous. I feared what might arise if I gave too much space to thoughts. So she kept moving, even exhausted. There were days when I felt irritation for no apparent reason. Little things bothered me more than they should. I was surprised, because I was always patient. I didn't recognize that version of me. But instead of investigating, I repressed. I thought it was just another sign of tiredness. On some nights, sleep came, but it brought no relief. I woke up with the feeling that something was pending, unresolved. As if there was a conversation that never happened, a truth that was never spoken. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I felt like I was there, waiting. I even thought I was getting weak. That maybe he wasn't dealing well with the passage of time. This idea bothered me, because I was always proud to endure it, so I demanded even more. I tried to be strong as I always was, even when it cost me dearly. Fatigue also affected my willingness to socialize. I isolated myself more, avoided long meetings, deep conversations. Not because I didn't like people, but because I lacked the energy to sustain anything beyond the superficial. And this increased the feeling of loneliness even more. At times, I even wondered if that fatigue had an emotional origin. But he soon pushed that thought away. It seemed too complicated, too abstract. I always preferred to deal with the concrete, with what could be seen and solved. Feelings were more difficult to organize. Today I know that fatigue did not come only from the body. It was the weight of a lifetime lived in restraint. Years holding words, desires, questions. None of this disappears. Everything accumulates. And there comes a time when the body begins to speak what the mouth has never said. The tiredness that does not sleep was a warning. A sign that something needed to be looked at more carefully. At the time, I wasn't ready to understand it yet. But he was already announcing that something was about to change. And I would no longer be able to ignore it for long. What changed everything was not a grandiose event, one of those that draw attention from outside. It was something simple, almost banal. An ordinary day, like so many others. Maybe that's why it was so impactful. There was no preparation, no warning. It just happened, and I felt that something inside me had shifted. I was organizing old things when I found a forgotten object. Nothing special at first glance. But it brought back memories that I didn't expect to revisit. Situations that I had kept somewhere far from memory began to emerge more clearly. Not as accusations, but as findings. And that left me disconcerted. As I was going through those memories, I realized that there was a whole story that I had never told even to myself. I always justified, explained, softened. At that moment, for the first time, I just watched. Without trying to correct, without trying to soften. And that was uncomfortable. I felt a mixture of sadness and clarity. Sadness for what was lost, clarity for what was finally shown. It was not a sudden revelation, but a slow fitting of pieces. Everything I had felt over the years began to make sense. And this sense was not pleasant. I remembered how many times I doubted myself. How many times have I convinced myself that I was exaggerating? How many times have I kept quiet to keep everything in order? As I looked back on these memories, I noticed a pattern that I never wanted to admit. It was no coincidence. It was repetition. That day, the silence that always accompanied me seemed heavier. I sat down and stood there, not knowing what to do. There was no immediate decision to make, nor a concrete action. There was only consciousness. And this awareness hurt more than any external conflict. I cried, but not like before. It wasn't a quick cry of outburst. It was a contained, deep cry, as if I was crying for all the times I couldn't. Each tear seemed to carry years of restraint. And I let it come, without trying to interrupt. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I wasn't wrong. That perhaps she had not been weak, nor ungrateful, nor exaggerated. This idea scared me more than it comforted me. Because, if I wasn't wrong, then something much bigger needed to be reviewed. I spent the rest of the day in silence, but it was a different silence. It was not the usual automatic silence. It was an attentive silence, full of thoughts that no longer wanted to be ignored. I felt that I had crossed an inner boundary. I didn't know yet where it would take me. That night, I slept poorly. The mind did not stop. But along with the discomfort, there was something new. A feeling that I could no longer pretend not to see. Something had broken, and there was no way to put it together in exactly the same way. And I knew that. That was the day something inside me broke. Not violently, but definitively. From then on, I could no longer return to the same internal place. Even though I didn't know what would come next, I felt that a truth had begun to emerge. And she would not accept any more silence. What comes now is the hardest part to share. To speak of this means to revisit choices that have cost me years of my own life and to accept truths that I have spent too much time hiding. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that some stories only survive when someone has the courage to listen to the end. So I ask you to sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that voices like this don't get lost in silence. After that day, something changed in the way I remembered the past. Memories were no longer scrambled by justifications. They appeared sharper, more raw. I started reviewing old scenes without trying to explain them right away. I just watched. And the more he observed, the more difficult it became to sustain the idea that it had all been love. I began to recognize patterns that I used to call difficult phases. Situations in which I always gave in, always adjusted, always diminished myself. I had spent years believing that this was part of any lasting relationship. But now, as I looked further away, I realized that the effort was never balanced. And this realization bothered me deeply. What struck me the most was realizing how I had learned to doubt myself. Whenever something hurt me, I looked for a reason to relativize. I thought that maybe I was too sensitive, too demanding. This constant doubt did not come out of nowhere. It has been built, repeated, reinforced over time. I also began to remember the phrases I had heard so many times. Phrases said calmly, almost like advice. They always seemed reasonable, but they carried an invisible weight. Gradually, I understood how those words shaped my reactions. How I was taught to accept more than I should. It was not easy to admit this. Part of me still resisted. After all, accepting that it wasn't love meant reviewing a whole life. It meant admitting that I stayed in something that diminished me. And that idea hurt more than the relationship itself. I needed time to sustain this truth without blaming myself. There were times when I felt angry. Not an explosive rage, but a silent one. Anger for having believed, for having stayed, for having annulled myself. Soon after, sadness came. A deep sadness, for everything I didn't live, for everything I left for later. Emotions that I had never allowed myself to feel together. Gradually, I came to understand that what I called love was, in fact, a mixture of habit, fear, and conditioning. There was no open evil, no visible violence. There was subtle control, imposed silence, limits that I never had the courage to question. And this also leaves marks. Recognizing this did not bring me immediate relief. On the contrary, it brought a new weight. But it was a different weight, more honest. For the first time, I wasn't trying to protect a story that didn't protect me. I was just looking at her as she went. And that required courage. I spent days reflecting on this discovery. Sometimes I felt like denying everything and going back to the old version, where things were simpler to explain. But something inside me no longer allowed that. The truth, once seen, does not accept to be easily ignored. Understanding that it wasn't love changed the way I saw myself. I stopped seeing myself as weak or insufficient. I began to realize that I did the best I could with what I knew. And that doesn't erase the pain, but it changes the weight of the guilt that I've carried for so long. This understanding was the second great shock of my life. Not because it brought an immediate solution, but because it opened a door that I could never close again. From then on, I knew I would need to deal with what came next. And, even though I was afraid, I was starting to prepare for it. After recognizing that it wasn't love, something began to change inside me. It was not immediate or simple, but it was real. The guilt that has always accompanied me began to lose strength, little by little. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I wasn't solely responsible for everything that went wrong. This idea seemed strange, almost forbidden. For a long time, I believed that if something didn't work, it was my fault. I hadn't been patient enough, understanding enough, dedicated as I should have been. This logic has always kept me trying a little longer. But now, looking back more clearly, I began to realize how unfair this was to me. I started to revisit some decisions with another look. Not to judge myself, but to understand. I made choices within the limits I was taught. I was conditioned to stay, to give in, to endure. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me human, shaped by a context that has never offered me clear alternatives. This understanding did not erase the pain, but changed its form. Before, the pain was accompanied by shame. Now, it was accompanied by sadness and compassion for myself. I started to look at the woman I was with more care. For the first time, without constant internal accusations. There were times when guilt tried to come back. She still knew the ways well. But now I was able to question her. He asked where he came from, who he really served. And often, she didn't have convincing answers. This gave me a new sense of emotional autonomy. I also realized how much I had normalized situations that shouldn't have been normal. Silence, annulment, constant adaptation. All of this started to have another name inside me. It was not an exaggeration. It wasn't drama. It was the consequence of years of living in containment. I began to allow myself to feel anger without condemning myself for it. A calm anger, without outbursts. An anger that recognizes crossed limits. Along with it, came a silent mourning for what I did not live. And I understood that I needed to go through this grief to move forward in a more complete way. Gradually, I let go of the idea that I should have done it differently. At that time, I didn't have the tools I have today. I acted as I knew, as I learned. This acceptance brought a discreet but profound relief. It didn't solve everything, but it created room to breathe. This internal change began to reflect on the way I positioned myself. Small things, small choices. I didn't explain myself so much. He no longer apologized for feeling. Still cautiously, but more firmly. It was as if I was relearning how to occupy my own space. Guilt has not completely disappeared, but it has ceased to be dominant. She no longer guided all my emotions. For the first time, I felt that I could build something different, even late. And this possibility, in itself, was already transformative. Understanding that I wasn't the only one to blame changed everything. Not to erase the past, but to make it fairer to me. From then on, I no longer carried the same weight. Something had been returned to the right place. And that paved the way for the next step. For a long time, I imagined that liberation needed to be accompanied by confrontation. He thought of difficult conversations, of harsh words, of long explanations. But none of this happened the way I imagined. What came was quieter. An understanding that was installed little by little, without fanfare, but firmly enough not to be ignored. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need to convince, justify, or retell my story in detail. The truth was already clear within me. And that was enough. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to be externally validated to believe what I felt. There was a conversation, yes, but it wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations or attempts to rewrite the past. I said little, I chose the words carefully. More than talking, I observed. And as I watched, I realized that I no longer expected understanding. Something in me had changed. The most important thing was not what was said, but what I stopped accepting. Small impositions, comments that previously silenced me, expectations that I automatically met. I began to interrupt these movements within me. Not with anger, but with awareness. And that made all the difference. I also had to accept that some answers would never come. That certain people do not change, do not reflect, do not recognize. Before, this would have frustrated me deeply. Now, I understood that it was not my responsibility to conduct this process. I could go on without this idealized closure. This acceptance brought an unexpected peace. Not a joyful or light peace, but a firm peace. The peace of those who stop fighting with themselves. I stopped waiting for the past to adjust so I could move on. I followed in spite of him. To free myself did not mean to break with everything. It meant repositioning myself. Review limits, reduce access, change expectations. Small external changes accompanied a much larger internal transformation. I was relearning how to exist without diminishing myself. There were moments of doubt, of course. Sometimes the old need to please tried to come back. But now I recognized that impulse. And when I recognized him, I could choose differently. This possibility of choice was something new to me. And she was powerful. I realized that I didn't need to scream to be heard. Neither by others, nor by myself. It was enough to sustain what I felt, without asking permission. This silent but firm posture changed the way I related to the world. And with me, I started to occupy my space in a more complete way. Not demanding, but also not automatically backing off. It was a new balance, still under construction. But even so, I felt that I was on the right track. A path that finally seemed mine. Liberating myself was not a one-time act, it was a process. A process that began when I stopped screaming inside. When I accepted that I no longer needed to convince myself of anything. I already knew. And that was enough to move forward, with more truth than ever. Today, when I look back on the life I've lived, I don't do it with the same harshness as before. I don't romanticize the past, but I don't deny it either. He existed, shaped me, brought me here. And even with all that I've lost along the way, there's something important about acknowledging the truth now. To understand late is still to understand. And that changes everything. I no longer try to make up for the time that has passed. I learned that this is an impossible battle. What I can do is take care of the time I still have. Even if it's not much, it's mine. For the first time, I feel like I can use it more consciously, without so many automatic concessions. Some people walked away when they realized that I no longer functioned the same way. Others simply did not understand. At first, it hurt. I always feared displeasing her. But, over time, I realized that this distance was also a sign of change. Not everyone follows when we start to respect each other. I started to value silence in a different way. No longer as an imposition, but as a choice. A silence that allows me to listen to my own thoughts, my desires, my limits. It no longer weighs as it used to. Now, he organizes me from the inside. I still carry regrets. It would be a lie to say otherwise. Sometimes I think about what could have been different, but those thoughts no longer paralyze me. They come, stay for a while, and then go. I don't boss them around anymore, nor do they boss me around. I learned that love does not require disappearance. That care does not suffocate. That staying shouldn't come at the cost of one's own identity. These lessons came late, it is true. But they came. And I carry them with the seriousness of someone who knows the value they have. If I could talk to those who still live in silence, I would say to pay attention to the small signs. In that persistent feeling of discomfort, in that guilt that has no name, in that tiredness that does not go away. None of this comes about by chance. Everything calls for listening. It doesn't take major disruptions to start different. Sometimes, it all starts with a simple question, asked in a low voice. Does what I'm feeling matter? What do I want still have room? These questions, when asked honestly, are a start. Today, at 72, I don't have all the answers. But I have something that I have lacked for a long time, clarity. I know what I lost, I know what I experienced, and I know what I don't want to repeat anymore. This does not erase the past, but transforms the present. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told. It took me a while, it's true. But even late, they still matter. They matter because they liberate, because they reorganize, because they give back dignity. And it is with this truth that I continue, finally whole. If something in this story has touched you, please share this video with someone who may not be able to put it into words yet. What has been told here is not just an individual experience, but a reflection of patterns that have silenced many people for years. Sharing is not about releasing a video, it is an act of solidarity with those who need to hear that they are not alone. I'll stay here reading every comment. What city or country are you watching this from, and what of this story has stayed with you? Knowing that these words reach someone really means a lot to me.